I'm David Moore. I'm from the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at the Australian National University. And the topic this morning is skullduggery, which I think means something to do with espionage. And of course there's the opposite of it, counter-espionage, security intelligence, protection of records. And I was reminded yesterday that we had an intelligence session dealing with signals intelligence and DSD, and I'll mention that again in a minute. And I have some little experience of some of these matters. I wrote a book, An Official History of ASIO, and when I was writing this history, I had to go to see a very senior government official. And the senior government official said, "Why are you writing this history of ASIO?" And I said, "Well, ASIO's asked me to do it for various reasons, and one of them is to dispel some of the myths of Australian espionage." And he said, "What myths?" And I said, "Well, how about the myth that ASIO organised the defection of Petrov to keep the Labor Party out of power for the next 20 years?" He said, "That's not a myth, that's true." And of course, I am also aware of the clearance issues. I wrote a book about the SAS, and the early chapters of the SAS deal with the decisions to form it and to increase it and so on. And when the time came to publish it, the Army, in the guise of the Director of Coordination in the Army, said that the book could not be released. And I wanted to know why. And he said, because of all these footnotes that deal with DSD. And I said, well, if you know anything about the Army, I say to the Director of Coordination, your predecessor many years ago was known as the Director of Staff Duties, and all those DSDs that you see in the footnote refer to the Director of Staff Duties, not to the Directorate of the Defence Signals Directorate. So it just indicates that some of the people in the bureaucracy have short memories, but they keep their eyes open for anybody who might be doing the wrong thing. Now, I'm very pleased this morning to introduce two speakers. The first speaker is Dr. Rhys Crawley. And Rhys is eminently qualified to talk about his topic because he worked for 3 years on the official history of ASIO. And I think Rhys has the distinction of being the only researcher in Australian history who has worked on 3 official histories, having moved on from the official history of ASIO to peacekeeping official history and now the official history of Iraq and Afghanistan. So it's my great pleasure to introduce my good friend, Rhys Crawley.
Thanks to David and to our hosts for putting this on and inviting me. David was my first ever boss. He gave me a job and it allowed me to get a mortgage. That and the fact I married a lawyer. So what I'm going to talk to you about today really is ASIO's counter-espionage approach against the Soviets in the Cold War and delivered it somehow. And look at some of the trends and changes across that period. So it's going to be a bit of a race through the Cold War from ASIO's perspective. And it is from ASIO's perspective. So when we did the ASIO official history, we had full access to ASIO's records. But of course, if we want to know the absolute details about what the Soviet Union was up to in Australia, we would need to see the Soviet archives. So it is very much what ASIO knew and what ASIO did against the Soviet threat. It is based... Push it twice. Go too far. There you go, backwards. No. It is based on these 3 books. The Official History, 3 volumes. So David, who we just heard from, he's the boss of all 3 volumes. He wrote the first one, The Spy Catchers, which was an award-winning book. Because of the excellent research in it, I'm sure, David. John Blaxland wrote the second, and then John and I wrote the 3rd volume. So it's very much based on these books, so would encourage you to buy them all. We don't get the royalties, so this isn't one of those shameless plugs to get money. The Commonwealth gets your money. I'm going to use KGB throughout. It's not always called the KGB, but it's just easier. So we heard yesterday in a couple of our lectures about espionage during the Second World War. We heard about leaks of ultra secret. We heard about this thing called the Dominoes project. And you can see that on the left. That's the US Army's decryption of Soviet diplomatic and intelligence traffic from capitals around the world back to Moscow. So those codes were broken, and it led to evidence of espionage. Some evidence, sometimes it's just people named, like prime ministers and presidents and things, but evidence of espionage around the world. That went on top of 1945 defection in Canada by a cipher clerk, Igor Gazenko. You might have seen photos of him before. I don't have one here, but every time he was on TV, he wore a white hood and sort of looked like a Ku Klux Klan. And that was to protect his identity. And when he had defected in 1945, he brought documents out and it showed that espionage was occurring. The Dominoes project shows the same. And as far as we're concerned in Australia, it shows that there were a spy network operating in Australia with links to the Department of External Affairs. Material, including top secret classified material, was leaking from that department through the Soviet embassy in Canberra, through some cutouts back to Moscow. US learns of this, cuts off intelligence to Australia. They will not share intelligence with Australia until Australia gets its affairs in order and can provide security for its documents. And so the result of that, and this, I mean, David covers this in tens of thousands of words, but it's the creation of ASIO in March of 1949. ASIO was established because of espionage, and it was established to catch spies. Hence the title of David's book, The Spy Catchers. Its first work was really, after employing people and getting buildings and such, was this thing called the case. So we can see it on the right here. These cryptonyms, the Clod, Tourist, Burr, Sestra, etc., they're the code names that appear in this phenomena traffic. One of ASIO's first jobs was to figure out who these people were, for bits of information without blowing the source, the original source being signals intelligence. So ASIO officers would go out and do investigations. This person fits the profile of the limited information we've got, place them under surveillance, and start trying to uncover and understand what these networks were doing. So it places people like Wally Clayton, who's at the top of the spy ring, Claude, place him under surveillance, place his house under surveillance. What we now know is that these other various people, through various means, were passing information to Wally Clayton, who was passing it to a guy who's going to be on the next slide, Fyodor Nosov, who was a TASS agent, so a journalist, but actually a KGB officer undercover of a journalist. He was passing it to the KGB resident at the Soviet embassy in Canberra, and he was passing it back to Moscow. So they place people like Wally Clayton under surveillance. They interview others. For Nosov, they place him under surveillance, place his premises under surveillance. They see who comes to meet him, and then they follow those. And one of those people that comes to meet him regularly is Alan Dalziel, who was the private secretary to Doc Emmet at the time. They have telephone interception on various individuals, approved verbally by the Prime Minister. There's no such thing as warrants at this time. The fact of telephone interception was pretty tightly guarded secret even within ASIO. It's known as Hawk, so there'd be Hawk operations. So you don't write telephone interception tells us this. It would be Hawk, or they would use, they would give names to the source. So I think one is Bob Kelly. So Bob Kelly tells us, which was, this person has said this on the phone, we've listened to him and taken notes. Or they would put other people, so that the KGB resident at the time, maybe the first couple of months of ASIO's existence, Semyon Makarov, they place him under surveillance when he's moving about Australia, and he's employing counter-surveillance the entire time. He's got ASIO's mark. They are amateurs, and he's just jumping off trams the wrong direction, and he knows exactly what's happening. So Wally Clayton on that previous slide, he did more for Australian security intelligence than any other individual. ASIO was established because of the espionage he was conducting. Some really early photos from ASIO's early days. Its first headquarters there on the left, Agincourt at Potts Point in Sydney. Its first Director General, Justice Geoffrey Reed, for about a year, a little bit over a year. The Director General for the next 2 decades, Colonel, later Brigadier Sir Charles Spry. See down the bottom, we heard of him yesterday as the Director of Military Intelligence. Fyodor Nosov, who I mentioned, the TASS agent, in the top left. And what we have here on the right is Nosov's flat in Sydney. So ASIO's first ever technical operation, i.e. a microphone, was against this flat. Now in the ASIO official history, David wasn't able to tell you whether where ASIO's listening post was, but what happened is ASIO got a family, the Doherty family, who worked for ASIO, and they rented the flat, and it's either above, below, left or right of this. We weren't able to tell you which one, but they put a microphone into Nelson's flat, and then they recorded his conversations. And so the Doherty family with their kids lived in this flat. So ASIO's first technical operation, and then a bunch of the early ASIO officers here. We interviewed any of these who were still alive. David or I interviewed. So while all of this is happening, focus is on catching spies, focus on the Communist Party, and focus on protective security. The aim is to stop communists getting into positions of access where they can get classified information, and therefore prevent espionage through things we know today as security clearances. So they're vetting public servants. It's not like the sort of forms we have to do today, but they're vetting that as an early form of security. And it all goes hand in hand with counter-espionage. And a big focus is protecting the secrets we heard of yesterday at places like Woomera. So those secrets need to be protected. You need to make sure only the correct people are getting access to that place and those people. So there's a big focus on that. So we start with investigating links and trying to find out how people are connected. In late 1950, the MI5 liaison officer, Courtney Young, and he'd been part of setting up ASIO, and he's the one who knows that Benona exists, whereas barely anyone in ASIO does, apart from the Director General. He says to ASIO, I recommend you start focusing on the Soviet embassy rather than the individuals that may have had contact with the Soviet embassy. Let's see if you can uncover any other spy networks. So it's a bit of a slight shift in approach, and he says defection is what you want. Charles Spry, as we heard, is, what we can see there, is appointed Director General of ASIO in mid-1950, and he tries to bring some focus to this, and he starts issuing directives on what ASIO's preferences will be. And they're also influenced by a US academic who visits Australia. He gives a lecture to ASIO staff and speaks about his experience with defectors. So this reinforces the idea that if you're going to have an objective in your counter-espionage work, it's to get a defection. Get a Russian Soviet intelligence officer to defect and change sides. So they go towards that. Spry later said to a journalist, when I took over ASIO, we realised that the best thing we could do was not to follow Soviet agents around, but to get a defector from the embassy. Then we're on the pig's back. We get everything. They tried in 1952 to get a Soviet official who's returning by ship home to defect. They put ASIO officers on the ship and signed up next to him. It didn't work. It was sort of good practice. What they realised though is they still need to learn more about who these people are. And so in 1953, ASIO launches Operation Wanderer, and this is going to be a mass surveillance effort of the Soviet embassy. The people that work there, when they come and go, and anyone that visits them. And so Operation Wanderer it was called, ran from June to October. It began with a surveillance operation using ASIO's cutting-edge surveillance vehicle. You can see there, codenamed Ostrich. You wouldn't believe it, but it's parked, well you probably would because it says it in the caption, but it's parked right opposite the Soviet embassy. Inconspicuous. But that's what the inside of Ostrich looked like, and doing surveillance. It moved from that to getting a team of 8 guys from all around Australia, bring them together, and they conducted Australia's first mass surveillance operation. You can see them here. They lived out near HMAS Harmon, out near Canberra, and they would travel in under the cover of darkness to the Soviet embassy, which is still where the Russian embassy is today in Canberra. If you know Canberra well, the Kingston Hotel is right across the road. So they have a room at the Kingston Hotel and they do this and take photos and write. And there was a work shed just opposite here. And they go into the work shed before it got dark, before it got light, stay in there all day, pee in a bottle, conduct their surveillance, and then at night leave and go back to their base. And they also had car teams, so they're doing mobile and static surveillance. And there's telephone interception on the embassy as well at the same time. What it mostly showed was that there was this diplomat who had arrived in 1951. He'd been placed under a bit of surveillance, but not a lot. But it showed that he had a bit more freedom of movement than you would expect, and his name was Vladimir Petrov. So ASIO then focuses its attentions over time on him a bit more. Now, of course, he'd already come to ASIO's attention, as I said, in 1951 when he got off the ship. ASIO was there to take photos of him. But it had this agent on the left, Dr. Michael Belogusky, Ukrainian-born, had moved to Australia, served for a bit in the second AIF, played violin, a medical doctor, and he had met Petrov through the Russian social club in Sydney, and he's an ASIO agent. He doesn't work for ASIO in an employee sense, he's the source of information. He's acting under brief from ASIO, he gets close to Petrov. The story develops over 2 chapters in David's book, but essentially gets to the point where Petrov says, I want to remain. And that's what Petrov does. The guy in the bottom left, unsung hero of ASIO at this time, because Michael Belogusky would have been the most difficult agent to ever run. He's also the most famous ASIO agent that's been outed. But Gilmour ran him very well because he was a difficult character. We know Petrov defected. Vladimir Petrov defects 70 years ago last week, and Evdokia, his wife, also an intelligence officer, defected on the 20th of April. There's a gap because husband didn't tell wife he was going to defect. So she's getting taken back to the Soviet Union, and she decides to stay and remains in Australia. And you will have probably seen that photo before. She's missing a shoe. Great photo. It results in a royal commission, for which ASIO is out in the spotlight for the first time. I do want to tell you my favourite archival find because it relates to Michael Belogusky and Vladimir Petrov. So David did most of the Petrov research. So I sort of went and did whatever David told me to do. But he did most of the Petrov stuff because he already knew quite a lot about it and it was a better use of resources. But I had read some of these agent reports. And maybe 6 months later, I was looking through these envelopes which weren't catalogued. I said, what is this? And I get to this photo and it's a fat, naked man lying on a couch with his back to the camera and his big testicles hanging out between his legs. It's a naked Vladimir Petrov that Dr. Michael Belogusky took a photo of when he was passed out on Belogusky's couch to use it to blackmail him. The best archival find. I didn't show you that one, David, so thank you for that. That photo still lives in ASIO's records. It didn't make its way to the National Archives, but I've seen Petrov calls. So. Anyway, so Petrov defects, it results in a royal commission. That royal commission concludes that espionage had been occurring in Australia. Surprise, surprise, but it has to protect the Venona secret. It can't reveal that there's this signals intelligence. Petrov's documents, his testimony, the testimony of others leads the commissioners who knew about Venona to conclude that espionage had occurred. And now we have another source that proves something that we had to otherwise keep protected. It also results in a break of diplomatic relations between Australia and the Soviet Union from 1954 to 1959. In that period, about the only thing ASIO does on the Soviet embassy is install a microphone and a windowsill in its premises. Technically successful in that they install it and it works, never gets any product. So that no one ever talks in that room ever again, or it's found. It's hard to get back into the Soviet embassy premise once they move back. So that operation goes nowhere. But ASIO also focused at that time on trying to identify if there was a stay behind an illegal KGB or GRU, which is Military Intelligence Network. So it focuses on that, and it focuses on things like the Communist Party and other embassies. So in the absence of the Russians, it focuses on others and stays very busy. The Russians came back. Soviets came back in 1959. And the top priority target was the guy on the left, Ivan Skripal. We see here a couple of photos relating to another one of ASIO's most famous operations against the Soviets, Ivan Skripal. The lady there, Kay Marshall, she had been a security agent in New Zealand with access to the Russians. She transfers across to Australia. Skripal thinks she's an agent working for him. She's actually an agent working for ASIO. She's a double agent. They're having clandestine meetings at places like Taronga Park Zoo, which you can see there. He's directing her to communicate via secret writing, to go to dead letter drops around Sydney, so Sydney Harbour Bridge, and at the Woolloomooloo Stairs here, you can see a picture. So that's secret writing that's been developed. It shows her where the dead letter box is on these stairs, and you can see a photo there. And also, she gets a passport with a loose photograph. She gets a high-speed message scrambler that she's meant to hand over to someone in Adelaide. She goes there to conduct this meeting. The person that's meant to receive this package never does. They know that there's espionage occurring here. government expels Skripal in 1963, and then ASIO goes on the hunt to try and find out who this illegal operative, who has no connection to the embassy, who it might be. They never uncovered that. There were some stories a couple of years ago about who that might be. There were public leads at the time, about 350 leads from the public. You know, we know who that photo in that passport is, but it didn't lead anywhere. ASIO really uses it as a way to communicate with the public that espionage is a threat. So it had the Royal Commission, that makes it pretty clear. It does it again, and it creates this film, Legal Resident. It uses it to brief unit security officers, but also the public on the threats of espionage. Google this video if you're interested. Legal Resident, you'll find it on the National Archives website. It is fascinating. So Kay Marshall is interviewed, and there's excerpts of recordings that were taken from a tape in her handbag of Skripal talking. It's fantastic. So we've gone from collect, defect, now they've gone to expulsion. We then get in the 1960s a focus on more analysis and research. So ASIO creates for the first time a position called the Operations Analyst Officer, and also because of concerns that perhaps ASIO has been penetrated, and that's maybe why the illegal didn't turn up in Adelaide, they start to look internally in counterintelligence, and they have this section called the National Estimate Section, small section that looks at ASIO's own internal security, looking for leads about whether it had been penetrated. So that starts in the early 1960s. And we also get in 1963, ASIO establishes its first dedicated surveillance unit. So before that, it had been officers brought in from other duties to do surveillance. They start recruiting young men, 19, 20, bring them in for their first jobs in ASIO. They're unknown to every other ASIO officer. They're not allowed to go to ASIO premises. They live in houses together, generally on the main routes that the Soviets would use to drive, whether it's in Sydney or in Canberra, and they place people under surveillance all the time. So operational base establishment was what it was called. Really tight need to know that it even existed, and their product would be fed back into ASIO, and the origins of that would be protected as well. Still really focused on learning who's who at the embassy. So understand and get leads about who they are, who they meet, by whatever means. So that be human intelligence, sources and agents, or technical intelligence, so microphones or CCTV. And then from that, focus on fewer cases and subject them to greater coverage. At this time, ASIO is really only able to focus on proper coverage on 2 individuals simultaneously. That's the resources it takes to place people under surveillance. And then they would target these people, so either recruit them, get them to pass information to you, generally about what's happening in the country. It's not recruiting for the sake of recruiting and then controlling them when they go back home. It's not really ASIO's focus. It's just about recruiting them to get intelligence on espionage, or to disrupt them, and then thirdly, to expel them if you need to. It's a great photograph, or a couple of photographs here. You can see the Soviet embassy here on the left, this area here. And the photo on the right is the first instance in ASIO's history where it was a surveillance operation that provided the initial lead of counter-espionage. A guy called Vladimir Alexei, the third secretary at the embassy, was one day driving through Canberra in mid-1970, screams to a halt in his car in the suburb of Manica. He's then followed for a while until the surveillance officers break contact because it's no longer safe to do so. They go back to the embassy, the Russians, and then an observation post near there says, hey, they've left the embassy again, they're going off in separate directions. It just so happens to be that an ASIO officer from this surveillance unit is at the Canberra hospital, which no longer exists. It's where the National Museum is today. But he's there, and he sees Alexei pull up and go into the hospital and then walk out with an unidentified man. They get in Alexei's car and they drive to Black Mountain Peninsula, which is right near the ANU. The ASIO officer follows, puts them under surveillance, takes photographs. They have a 3-hour meeting in the car. And so we have a photo here of that meeting. When they leave, the ASIO officer follows back to the hospital, sees who the unidentified man is, sees the car he goes to, gets his rego details, and then finds out who he is. He's a clerk in the Australian Army, Yugoslav-born clerk in the Australian Army. So ASIO then figures, this is bad. Someone with access to information, meeting with a Russian in pretty dubious circumstances. What are we going to do about it? Well, they find out that he's due to clean the photocopier in the office. So they put up CCTV, they monitor that photocopier, they leave some classified information there, hoping that he'd copy it and walk out with it to give it to the Soviets, and they got the police ready to nab him. He never turned up for his shift. But anyway, ASIO finally decides to interview him, they recruit him as a double agent, and then he disappears. And I find him years later, he's living in Wollongong, God's country, it's where I'm from, and talk to him, and he says, yes, I was trained and recruited as a KGB agent to report, and then they try and reactivate him as a double agent. But again, you see this sort of shift where surveillance is coming to the core, it's becoming a bit more professionalised, and we're getting lucky leads that lead to potential counter-espionage. The Whitlam years, the focus from the government is on Croatian terrorism and really distrust of ASIO. We see that in the Attorney General's raid of ASIO headquarters in St Kilda Road in 1973. There's a real distrust there. There's less technical operations, there's less telephone interception on those targets, and so because they need warrants. And so ASIO starts doing the things that it doesn't need warrants for, and that's really focusing on humans and agent penetrations, trying to get people into the embassy. And we see a shift in thinking again. So doing deep studies of one or two individuals in the embassy rather than everyone, and then ASIO starts operationalising intelligence. So if it cannot recruit someone or get them to defect or expel them, they drop them as a focus. Don't worry about it, focus on someone we could perhaps turn. And they start, it's a real shift. An example of that in 1977 is this guy on the left, Andrei Duchkov. ASIO does an undercover operation. It gives one of its officers, and it had always used agents and cutouts to do this, it gets one of its own officers to go undercover. He pretends to be a boat salesman. He's a Vietnam veteran, being an officer in Vietnam. That's not him, that's the Russian. Andrei Duchkov, 30-year-old drunk, member of the embassy staff, father, a senior official in foreign affairs. ASIO wanted to recruit this guy and get him to report from inside the embassy. He lives away from the embassy. This ASIO officer, with his pseudonym, rents the flat next door, pretends to be a boat salesman. ASIO get him a yacht, and he sits there in his yard, and there's dummy businesses and people that are briefed to say, yes, he's my employee, yes, he's my husband, all this sort of stuff. And he'd go home on weekends to his family. He lived in Canberra, but he had to, part of his cover story was that he lived in Sydney, so he would leave Canberra on a push bike to catch the train or bus or something, and then a van would pick up and get him in and take him home to his family. An undercover operation that cost ASIO $100,000 at the time. It didn't lead to anything, but ASIO gets a psychologist involved at a time. They want to recruit this guy. He's a drunk, and he's seen by a surveillance van going to St Paul's Anglican Church here in Monica to a bush, rattling through. What's he doing? They go over and check, and there's half-drunk bottles of sherry. The guy is pissed all day, every day at work. And a psychologist says, this guy's unrecruitable, and if you do, you're not going to get anything useful out of him. So he's dropped as a target. But again, we see a shift in thinking from ASIO's perspective. One of the great stories of this is when they first meet, sort of around Christmas, having drinks on the balcony, they consume a carton of beer, absolutely blotto, and there's technical operations in this guy's flat, and they start learning more about his poor marital circumstances, and he and his wife don't get along. So they're all leads about how you might then change the operation. I won't say much about these guys, except they're probably the two most dangerous KGB officers in Australia. We've since learned that they recruited someone high in Australian intelligence. Lazovic, I remember when I was doing the research into Lazovic, we found that 14 files created on him had disappeared, been destroyed. We don't know what happened to them, but 14 volumes of ASIO files destroyed. We later know that ASIO was penetrated and that these guys controlled sources within ASIO. I can't really say much more than that because there's things we weren't allowed to say in the official history. But these two very good Soviet intelligence officers recruited and ran sources in Australian intelligence. Another famous case in ASIO's history, you may remember this, Operation Bushfowl. That house there in Curtin was being rented by Valery Ivanov, another KGB officer. ASIO got in, because it always gets in, and put microphones throughout the house. On the eve of the 1983 federal election, Valerie Ivanov had a visitor over. It was David Coombe, who had formerly been National Secretary of the Labor Party, was now a lobbyist, and he was clearly, from ASIO's perspective, being cultivated by Ivanov because of the access that he had to senior people in the Labor Party, including the soon-to-be Prime Minister Bob Hawke. ASIO learns of this, goes, oh God, but sits on its hands for a while because it doesn't want to get involved because of, think back to the Petrov affair and the things David said before, it sits on its hands for a little while. Eventually it briefs Hawke, Hawke goes bananas, and the government is banned from, government ministers are banned from having anything to do with David Coombe. It results in another Royal Commission, for which Peter Evans has written a lot about. We heard a bit about yesterday, Robert Hope and his Royal Commissions. This leads to the second of his Royal Commissions. And again, big trouble from that, from ASIO's perspective, is the need to protect sources. And so that it leads to sort of myths about who knows what and how they know it. What we see, and this will be the end of my presentation, is again another expulsion and then another change in how ASIO does business. So it starts to then just do direct approaches to people. So it'll go up to the local KGB guy and say, hey, I'm from ASIO, do you want to come to our side? So before it had used undercover officers, before that it had used agents, it now just goes up brazenly and says, we know who you are, we know what you're doing. And if nothing else, if that person doesn't switch sides, do it so that their colleagues know you're meeting with them and it disrupts them and makes their work impossible. And then we see another shift, and this results, I said before, those policy discussions. ASIO goes in hard and it wins this time, that anyone with an intelligence trace from our overseas liaison networks, just deny them a visa in the first place. Don't give them the opportunity to come to Australia and conduct espionage. Now again, that is a bureaucratic fight because what is of interest to security isn't necessarily of interest to diplomacy and trade. But that's the approach, and it's what we have finite resources. Why would we waste them on chasing people around? Let's just stop them coming here in the first place. So there's sort of various changes in ASIO's approach to counter-espionage in the Cold War. The wall comes down, everything is fine and dandy, and we forget about it, we pretend there's no problems. And of course, there are always concerns about penetration, which, as I said, we confirm in the official history in Volume 3. It was a chapter that David, John and I wrote together. It's the only chapter in all 3 volumes where the 3 of us all had our hands on it. Serious chapter. The fact that we were able to confirm that there had been penetration of ASIO was a big thing and was a big fight, wasn't it, David? It was hard to do. There's been a lot that's come out, particularly recently, about penetration. Encourage you to watch it, but we cannot confirm nor deny the veracity of that information. So that's it. Thank you.
I think we've got time for questions to Rhys right now, and then we'll do the second one the same. So the floor is open for questions.
Late last year there was a Four Corners program which revealed there was an inside mole in ASIO for a long time, and it created a lot of issues. They eventually, after an investigation of 25 years, they named the person. I can't remember the name, but my question is, I know you can't deny or confirm, but how serious was that investigation on ASIO's reputation of not being able to, it took a long time to find this particular person who infiltrated ASIO.
Yeah, so as I said in the presentation, in the early 1960s, ASIO started taking this sort of semi-seriously, I guess, and they would follow the little bits and pieces of information they had. And so this continues over time, and it sort of goes in waves about how seriously they take this and where that section is placed in the organisation and the resources that it has. But it sort of exists from the 1960s on. And every now and then you get concerns raised. The most serious concerns, I think, throughout that period were raised by the first Hope Royal Commission. It has a 4th supplementary report that wasn't widely circulated, and that spoke about concerns of penetration of the organisation, and essentially says to ASIO, you need to get a bit more serious about this and look at this harder. And ASIO does, to its credit, but it just keeps hitting dead ends with its investigations. And what you get over the decades is little bits and pieces of information that come out. So people, intelligence officers will defect in other parts of the world and they'll give information on what they know. And some of those provide extra clues to ASIO. They always keep landing at dead ends. So the period that we wrote about in the ASIO official histories, which finished in 1989, at 1989, ASIO absolutely is concerned about it, but it doesn't know who or whom these people are. And most of those leads come after the period we wrote about. Now we were, so that story in Four Corners about how ASIO went about trying to do its internal stuff, that's taken straight from the official history, absolutely. In terms of who it was or who it might have been, again, we can't comment on that. But if you have penetration or penetrations by moles inside your organisation, it makes essentially all the work they did against this target, or these targets, void. And that's a reality of penetration. One of the things we see throughout the ASIO history, and we don't just look at the work that we covered here today in the Soviets, we look against a whole range of targets. ASIO was pretty brave and took a lot of risks in its counter-espionage work. They had a lot of technical successes, being able to get into places, put microphones, have surveillance on those targets. They do a lot of that very successfully, including against the Soviets, but these ones don't really go anywhere for the most part, and they do have successes against other counter-espionage targets. So it's not like they're crap at counter-espionage work. There's other questions that have got to be raised about why they can have success against all these other targets and they're not having a lot of success against the Soviets. And it's because of traitors.
Thank you.
More questions?
How much of an influence did the Whitlam government have over ASIO in the early 70s?
Yeah, massively, and I think it's a fascinating time both internally within ASIO and externally the pressures that are on it. So it had a Director General, Peter Barber, who had been under Charles Sprye's sort of tutelage as his deputy for a long time. But within ASIO, Peter Barber wasn't seen as the rightful heir to the Director General's throne. There were some old and bolds, and there's a lot of leaks that occurred when he's Director General, and I always felt that they were leaks targeting his leadership. What he does, and then what the Whitlam government does, is challenge ASIO. I think Barber was sort of half good, half bad Director General. Good intellectually, but pretty indecisive, and not the kind of Charles Sprye leader that makes a decision. But he was challenging the organisation to make better cases to use its invasive powers. And that's required with a government like the Whitlam government that has this distrust of intelligence, but also a civil liberties, rightful civil liberties concern, especially with the Attorney General. And he says to ASIO, he does give them a lot of warrants, but he says, I'm not going to give you warrants just because you've always focused on this target. The just because we always have isn't a good enough case. So go away and make a better intellectual case about why you should be able to look at the Communist Party or why you should be able to look at this. And ASIO fails to do that. That's an internal thing, and it's not wholly the Whitlam government. The Whitlam government's, I think Whitlam himself was pretty good with ASIO. I think Murphy, the raid, was a horrible decision. I like that they challenged it, but the biggest outcome of all of that was the Royal Commission, the First Hope Royal Commission, which Peter's written about this better than anyone. It's a remarkable book, Peter, into the life and work of Robert Hope. It established the intelligence community we have today because it looked at all of these failures in the organisation, challenged it to be better. It had to change institutionally. There had to be better legislation. It had to be closer to government. It had to be part of this wider machinery. And that is what Whitlam did to ASIO. A remarkable change, but at the time, if you were in ASIO, it would have been horrendous. And particularly when Murphy raided the organisation.
More questions?
Doc Everett's office seemed to be a source of constant leaks through Rick Russell, Johannes Pickshop, and various other people. What is the verdict now about Doc Everett himself? Was he just an absolutely sloppy, careless manager who left confidential stuff on his desk, or was he with the Soviets?
Oh, sloppy, not a Soviet agent. He had always shown, so before ASIO, there had been security intelligence organisations, and he as Attorney General oversaw those as well. But he basically, before ASIO, he basically starved them of funds and resources, and there was all this infighting, and he sort of starved them so they couldn't be too powerful. He never really was comfortable with it. His staff clearly, and we know this through Venona, we know this, there's a photo there of Frances Burney who'd worked in his office. She admits to ASIO that she was copying information and giving it to Wally Clayton. The people around him, and there's more that were not on that slide, and they come out in the Royal Commission, were passing information. He didn't do anything about it. Now that is completely inappropriate as a leader, and he defends those people. And frankly, the guy who had a brilliant mind was wacky by the time Petrov defected, and his responses to the Petrov defection harmed the Labor Party and made him look like a fool.
Rhys, thank you for that. I think it's been an absolutely splendid presentation this morning. I learned things that probably I knew but I've forgotten. So thank you again, Rhys, and thank you for your attention this morning.
Cheers.